Nothing dramatic has to happen in 2026 for the global economy to change in a lasting way. No sudden crash. No single headline that explains everything. No moment where the world clearly breaks in two. In fact, the most important shifts rarely announce themselves at all. They show up quietly, in decisions that feel technical, in limits that used to feel flexible, suddenly becoming real. That's why 2026 matters. Not because it guarantees a crisis, but because it's the year when a lot of long-building pressures stop being theoretical and start shaping real outcomes. Most years feel important while we're living through them. Very few actually are. The years that matter tend to look ordinary at first, confusing, uneven, hard to summarize in a single sentence. Only later do they stand out as turning points. To understand why 2026 is shaping up to be one of those years, it helps to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in systems. Because systems don't fail all at once. They fail when their margins disappear. And several of the systems holding up the global economy are losing those margins at the same time. The first one is industrial power. For decades, the global economy ran on an unspoken arrangement. Advanced economies designed things. They controlled finance, branding, and intellectual property. Lower-cost countries manufactured those designs. As those countries grew richer, they moved up the ladder and passed simpler manufacturing to the next country behind them. Japan did it. South Korea did it. Taiwan did it. For a while, China appeared to be following the same path. But instead of passing the ladder down, China reinforced it. Over time, manufacturing didn't just expand there, it deepened. First came basic assembly, then components, then entire systems, smartphones, batteries, electric vehicles, drones, shipbuilding, solar. In each case, the pattern was similar. Early support created capacity at a scale private markets would never fund on their own. Competition inside the country was intense, often brutal. Margins collapsed. Most companies failed, and the few that survived emerged unusually strong. Not just cheaper, more integrated, more resilient, harder to replace. By the mid-2020s, this wasn't something you needed charts to understand. You could see it in supply chains. You could feel it in pricing pressure. You could hear it in how confident incumbents suddenly sounded defensive. What's different now is where that momentum is headed. In 2026, the pressure moves into areas that once felt protected. Advanced industrial machinery, chemical inputs, pharmaceutical precursors, parts of aerospace and space infrastructure. This doesn't mean dominance everywhere. China has failed before, and it will fail again in some sectors. But the direction matters more than perfection. Industrial leadership is concentrating. And when that happens, the rest of the world reacts. Not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Trade policy is often framed as belief. Free trade versus protectionism. Globalization versus nationalism. In reality, it's much simpler. Countries open up when they feel secure. They close ranks when they feel exposed. By 2025, that exposure was already spreading. Tariffs on steel, restrictions on vehicles, local content rules, investment screening in places that once welcomed capital without hesitation. And this wasn't driven by a single rivalry. It showed up in the Americas, in Europe, across parts of Asia. What changed wasn't global trade collapsing overnight. It was friction creeping in. More inspections, more paperwork, more political conditions attached to what used to be routine commerce. That friction raises costs, and higher costs force choices. Part of why this moment feels different is that the old development model is breaking down. For decades, there was an assumption that as countries grew richer, manufacturing would naturally move elsewhere. Wages would rise, factories would relocate. Automation disrupts that logic. When machines do more of the work, labor costs matter less. And when national security becomes a priority, governments prefer production at home even if it's not perfectly efficient. Instead of industries migrating, they're clustering. That creates pressure everywhere at once. Advanced economies lose ground they thought was secure. Developing economies lose opportunities they expected to inherit. In 2026, the response to this pressure won't be clean or coordinated. Some countries will push back hard. Others will hesitate. Some will quietly walk back policies that go too far. But the overall direction is clear. The world is moving toward a slower, more politicized, more fragmented version of globalization. And fragmentation has a cost. One place that cost shows up is government debt. For a long time, debt didn't feel like a binding constraint. Interest rates were low. Growth was steady enough. Populations were relatively young. When crises hit, governments spent their way through them, and it worked often enough to become habit. But the background conditions have changed. Populations are aging. Workforces are shrinking. Healthcare and pension costs rise automatically, year after year. These aren't policy choices. They're built into the system. Politically, they're also extremely difficult to confront. Raising retirement ages angers voters. Cutting benefits feels unacceptable. So leaders delay. They borrow. They refinance. They hope the problem stays abstract. By the mid-2022s, public debt levels in many advanced economies reach territory historically associated with wartime. And unlike those periods, there's no post-war demographic boom waiting to ease the burden. In 2026, that reality starts to feel tighter. Higher interest costs crowd out spending. Currencies become more sensitive. Inflation quietly becomes a pressure valve, sometimes tolerated, sometimes denied. This doesn't mean collapse. It means constraint. Governments begin to realize they can't promise everything at once anymore. And when fiscal space narrows, attention shifts toward growth engines that still feel open-ended. That's where artificial intelligence comes in. By now, warnings about an AI bubble are everywhere. Valuations look stretched. Some business models remain unclear. Capital flows heavily within a small group of companies. Those concerns aren't wrong, but they miss something important. This isn't a technology waiting to be adopted. It's already embedded. Companies aren't experimenting anymore. They're integrating. Data centers aren't speculative, they're filling up. Energy demand tied to AI is real and rising. That doesn't mean today's prices are justified forever. It means the timeline matters. Technological bubbles don't burst because people notice them. They burst when capital dries up or reality falls dramatically short. In 2026, neither condition is likely. Investment continues. Governments treat AI as strategic. Businesses still believe it changes productivity. The reckoning will come at some point. But 2026 is more likely to extend the cycle than end it. And that matters because AI doesn't exist in isolation. It strains energy systems. It deepens supply chain dependencies. It amplifies geopolitical risks, which brings everything to its most fragile intersection. Taiwan. For years, Taiwan has been the risk everyone knows about and quietly avoids thinking through. Public conversations focus on invasion scenarios: dramatic, obvious, cinematic. But the more realistic near-term risk is quieter. A quarantine, inspections, delays, pressure without formal war. From the outside, it might look technical, administrative, temporary. Economically, it would hit fast. Taiwan relies heavily on imported energy. Fuel reserves would last weeks, not months. Industrial output would slow almost immediately. Semiconductor supply chains would feel it across the world, and the response from other countries would be complicated. Sanctions would hurt everyone. Supply dependencies run both ways. Escalation would be costly, regardless of who blinked first. That ambiguity is exactly what makes this scenario dangerous. Markets are good at pricing known risks. They struggle with situations that don't fit clean categories. A quarantine isn't peace, but it isn't war either. In 2026, the probability of such a move remains uncertain, but it's no longer remote, and its consequences would overshadow almost every other economic debate. This is why 2026 stands out. Not because everything breaks, but because many systems start showing strain at the same time. Industrial concentration, trade friction, debt limits, technological acceleration, geopolitical uncertainty. None of these forces guarantees a specific outcome. Together, they narrow the path. The global economy isn't about to collapse, but it is becoming less flexible. And systems with less flexibility behave differently. They don't crash suddenly. They grind. Growth disappoints without a clear recession. Inflation lingers without panic. Tensions rise without resolution. This is what transition looks like. Years like this rarely feel historic while they're happening. They feel confusing, uneven, unresolved. Only later do they stand out as turning points. 2026 may be one of those years, not because of a single event, but because enough old assumptions stop holding. And once that happens, the future doesn't announce itself. It creeps in. The real question isn't what the next headline will be. It's whether the systems built for the last era are still capable of handling the next one. Because the biggest risk isn't being wrong about what happens next. It's being unprepared when it does.